just talk a little bit about the history of this particular topic and subject policy issue. Um, so to kind of explain, I started working in Colorado in child welfare in the early 1970s, and at that point, the child welfare system there was probably less than 10 years old, maybe only 5 or 6 years old, something like that. And the 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 child welfare system we have today, which is of course not, it's the new iteration. There's always been some version of a child welfare system, very, very different than what we have today. But the one we have today was developed in the 1960s and 70s in response to severe physical abuse cases, and particularly battered child syndrome cases where kids, multiple fractures, detached retinas. I mean, really horrendous assaults of babies, very young children, a lot of the time with multiple fractures and so forth. So that was the sort of the basis for the creation of the modern child welfare system in all 50 states. And it was not a federally created system, as amazing as it sounds. The states themselves created their own child welfare systems all within about a 10-year period of time. So a very, very rapid period of creative sort of policy development. And then the feds came in later within the next 10 years with their various and sundry requirements, like they always do when they fund things, right? But it was sort of like CAPTA stuff came in the mid 1970s, kind of after the fact of the creation. Well, because initially the system had been created around severe physical abuse cases, it turns out that the initial literature on this subject had a pretty simple type of an explanation. And it was that people who ended up abusing their kids, particularly in early childhood and very severely themselves, had been abused. And so there was the idea that, and almost a single factor type of an explanation, that severe physical abuse cases were sort of the cycle of abuse. And it had been, various explanations of that. I mean, the people who wrote the battered child syndrome, people that I was trained by at the University of Colorado Medical Center, Kemp, Helfer, Pollock, those people, they were famous people, but they had a pretty complex psychoanalytic explanation of that. But over the years, most people adopted a kind of more simpler form, which was that people who were abusive just learned how to be kind of like a social modeling, social learning kind of idea. That you became abusive because you were themselves abused, and that's kind of what you grew up with and were familiar with, and so on. So, and if you will remember, some of you way back when, maybe I've said this in other presentations that I've done, there was very much of a denial initially around the poverty related aspects of physical abuse, or especially neglect. And so, so given that that was the concern, and given the explanation, that is, abusive parents had learned how to be abusive in their families of origin, then initially the idea was that why would then child welfare agencies want to place kids in kinship care, that is, from the very families that had abused them and had perhaps responsible sort of in this generational cycle kind of idea there. So initially, because of this explanation, which was, by the way, very, very dominant and pervasive, even in scholarly circles for about a 20-year period of time. It really took a long time to learn the sort of the deficiencies of that explanation. Not that it was totally false, but that it didn't account for lots of cases, and it particularly didn't account for neglect, and it didn't count truthfully for a lot of physical abuse, right? But or for sexual abuse. Nevertheless, that was the explanation. So the idea then was that if kids had been abused in childhood, then they shouldn't be placed in families of origin. I mean, particularly with grandparents, but also with other family members as well. And so it took a long time. There was sort of like a period of development there, where there was very much probably as much of a negative view of kinship care for about 25 years, first 25 years of the child welfare system, as there is a positive view today, right? So it gradually evolved from a negative view to a less negative view to finally sort of a positive view to where it is today. While kinship care is almost viewed, by many child welfare folks and advocates as sort of the ideal. And I worked for a Casey Family Program from 2010 to 2016, and at Casey Family Program, there were people there who really did believe and strongly advocate for the idea that all foster care should be kinship care. So the idea of many, not necessarily the party line at Casey, but the view of a lot of Casey people was that non-kin care should kind of be phased out over time, and that all foster care would ultimately be kinship care if it was supported in the right way. So that is, like a 100, a completely whatever the right number is, 360-degree. That's just like a complete reversal of the thinking of the first 25 years of the child welfare system. Now, there are several reasons apart from the one that I've already mentioned, which is that little by little, scholars learned that this single factor explanation of physical abuse just was not true. That is, it was not true as a total explanation. And so as that became more evident, there also started to be changes in the view of kinship care. And in part, of course, because there were always shortages of foster homes, and particularly of the non-kin homes. So agencies were kind of little by little, sometimes against their better judgment, sometimes with a lot of resistance. Agencies that I worked for in Colorado and then later in Washington, I came to this state in 1978 and began working in the Spokane area then. And we began to have to consider kinship care more because we didn't have foster homes a lot of the time for a lot of the kids. And then in addition, we also found that when we didn't have kinship care, what happened, particularly with large sibling groups, I mean, if you had 3 or 4 kids in a family and they were all placed due to neglect or for some other reason, and you didn't have a kinship home, it was practically 100% sure that those kids were going to be split up. And so for years, I worked in the Spokane area where we had a residential facility that was run by the Catholic Church that was unusual in that it took whole sibling groups. And so that we could stop. And so it became evident to people, even without reading a bunch of research about it, just from having contact with the kids, that splitting up siblings was not a good idea. I mean, sometimes, occasionally, you had a really emotionally disturbed child that had to be separated from siblings for kind of obvious reasons, or sometimes because there had been sexual contact among and between sibling groups. That occasionally happened. But for the most part, the idea always was that we wanted to keep siblings together whenever possible, and that just proved to be pretty difficult, if not impossible, to do in non-kin foster care. So there started to be then more of a sort of a tolerance for the idea that in some situations we would want to use kinship care, and increasingly did in part of the shortages. And then over time, that idea gradually evolved through practice wisdom, through research, through all kind of issues around diversity, which we'll talk about here in a minute, to the idea that kinship care was really ought to be the preference for a variety of reasons that we will talk about as we go along here. And so there has been, I guess I want to say, a long history here. So there has been, for that reason, because at one time it was kind of a conflicted issue, a hotly debated issue in child welfare, not so much anymore, but it was for a long period of time. So there has really been a lot of research on the subject. So this is one of these subjects, I think I mentioned before when I did a presentation on reunification, that is just hundreds of studies on that subject. Well, there have been, if not hundreds, very, very large numbers of studies on kinship care. In this country and in other countries as well, and over a long period of time. And I would say that most of this research has pretty consistent findings. It's like any large body of research. It isn't, all studies are never going to say the same thing. But by and large, the majority of studies are going to have found pretty basic key things that I'm going to summarize here in just a minute here. And so let me just start off with some of the key kind of points that I want to emphasize here. So from very early on, it became obvious both at the practice level and in the research that probably the main strength of kinship care was that compared to non-kin care, it was more stable. And this has probably been the main research finding about kinship care for going on 30 years or so. That even when you control for behavior problems at entry into care, and I'm going to say more about that in just a second here, but even when you do that, and you have kids who look very similar on behavioral indicators, kinship care is by and large more stable, and a lot of times it's a lot more stable. And so it became evident, even when I worked in child welfare by the 1980s, I had worked in child welfare for a while because you just started to have an overwhelming concern about placement instability in foster care. And it became obvious that foster care systems were doing a very bad job of stabilizing, particularly behaviorally troubled kids in care, but also sometimes kids who weren't behaviorally troubled. So there's always been an issue and a concern around placement instability, lack of stability in foster care. And so kinship care had a major plus there, a major benefit. It was just by and large, on average, more stable. And that finding has been repeated over and over and over again. And I can say that I can honestly think of a single study that has found something different than that if you look at cases in the aggregate. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that kinship care is always stable, because obviously it's not. And it would be amazing if it was, but of course it's not. And that is particularly true with behaviorally troubled kids. So this is the second most, the finding that began to be evident from about, as much as 20, 25 years ago, was that while kinship care was more stable on average, the kids who entered kinship care compared to the kids who entered non-kin foster care on average had less behavior problems. So whenever you hear just straightforward comparisons of outcomes of kids in kinship, behavioral outcomes or educational outcomes of kids in kinship care versus kids in non-kin foster care, unless unless the researcher has controlled for behavior problems at entry into care, that's just an invalid study. That's just a study that that should just be ignored. So because there are big differences on average in the kind of kids who enter kinship care and the kinds of kids who enter non-kin foster care, not to mention the kids who go into residential care. So just a straightforward comparison across the board is kind of a meaningless comparison. But as I already said, the researchers, and there have been a number of them, who have gone to the trouble of controlling for behavior problems at entry into care, have found that kinship care nevertheless continues to have an advantage, and sometimes a pretty large advantage in reducing placement instability in care. So before I go any further, let me stop here and give anyone who wants a chance to ask a question or make a comment here. Any thoughts on what I've said today? Okay, so just a few other things. So there have been, over the years, a number of studies that have just described differences between kinship parents and non-kin parents, and maybe they're just sort of common sensey kind of things that you would have expect, since a lot of the relatives who kids are going to are grandparents. So on average, the kin parents are older, which is what you kind of would expect there, and they're also not as economically affluent. In fact, a lot of the kinship parents are pretty darn poor. And so, for that reason, issues around compensation have always been a big policy issue in child welfare. And so, in most states, and pretty much forever, at least in most states, kinship care and non kin foster care have not been compensated the same way. Generally speaking, and this has been true in Washington, kinship care, particularly for sibling groups, is not as well compensated as non kin care for sibling groups. And so there have been, because that was always a concern, and because the kinship parents are poor, there have been some states in the past that have made an effort to fix that. And most famously in Illinois in the 1980s and 1990s. So in Illinois, for example, they went through a period of 10 or more years where the state equalized the payments to the kin families and the non kin families. And what they found was that by doing that, they greatly increased the numbers of kids in foster care because they found that the families discovered that they could use foster care payments as sort of almost like a welfare benefit. And that a lot of the kids who were actually going into kinship care were actually the parents were living in the home of the grandparents. And it was I don't know, the strongest word would be scam. And that issue continues to this day about the issue of the poverty of relative economic needs of the kinship families compared to the non-kin families. And by the way, a lot of non-kin families are pretty poor too. So one of the findings about foster care in general over the years is that there are a lot of people with pretty low incomes, not necessarily with poverty level incomes by the federal poverty standard, but certainly compared to the median family income in this country, which is now in the probably $67,000 a year, something for a family of three or four. A lot of the foster families have lower incomes than that, and that is particularly true of the kinship families. So in some states, therefore, a lot of the kin families have been compensated through TANF or through welfare benefits as opposed to through a licensing and a foster care process. So there has been federal law for a long time that kinship families have to at least be offered the opportunity to go through the licensing process and therefore to become foster parents and to receive the same foster care payments that non kin families would receive. And that has always been a policy in this state. However, I worked in the system for a long time when I know, just as a matter of fact, that there was a lot of pressure to divert the kinship families to the TANF system because of issues of cost. And that was just the reality of how things worked at a point in time. And so a lot of the families, it was easy to influence families in that overall direction. You didn't have to put up with the hassles of a licensing process. You didn't have to, meet state regulations for the size of the homes and all that kind of stuff. And so it was easy to convince a lot of families or influence a lot of families just to go into the direction of just getting the TANF payments. But the families then would take a big loss if they had a sibling group. So again, very large differences between foster care rates paid per child and rates for sibling paid through TANF. And that issue continues to this day. And some states have again in recent years made an effort or actually done it to equalize the payments made to kin and non-kin. But any state that does that, because of the history of what happened in Illinois and some other states, every state has to figure out how to stop abuses of that system or what the state would regard as abuses, which is basically that some families have been able just to, hey, good, if my child's in foster care, that's great because my mother can get a foster care payment and we all live together, we all get along, it doesn't matter who has custody, that kind of thing. So states have to have some way of controlling that. And I haven't read anything recently in recent years that I would view as a candid discussion of that particular subject. But the issue of compensation continues very, very much to be an issue there around the kin and non-kin families because, of course, again, for the economic differences. And because a lot of times we are talking about sibling groups. And so you're talking about poor families, low-income families, making less than $30,000 a year, taking 2, 3, 4 kids. Well, that would be very, very difficult to say the least there. And I think that what has happened with some of the issues around the lack of adequate care, both in kinship care and non-kin care, really does have to do with this particular issue of inadequate compensation here for both the non-kin families and for the kin families as well. So In the Illinois question with paying for kinship care, were the outcomes for the kids better? So again, I don't remember a specific study of that subject in Illinois. There may be one, but over the years, so this is maybe a good time to sort of transition to this discussion of, well, what are the outcomes? I mean, apart from the stability issue. Apart from the stability issue, and here the research is more mixed, but I would say the weight of the evidence has found that there really isn't much of a difference. I mean, if you look at standard indicators in terms of educational, behavior problems, and so forth, and remember the deal here, a lot of the kids who go into kinship care have fewer behavior problems to start off with, right? But even when you control for that. So, insofar as studies have found differences, those differences tend to be on the side of kinship care. And there are some studies that have found that. Now, I think the last time I mentioned, and the study that I am most impressed by, and that I think really people need to really ponder at length, is a study from about 2008 by a group of researchers in the Midwest. And the lead author there is Beta. And I sent that study to Ryan after the last discussion that I did. That was a study of opiate exposed children, that is, exposed in utero, and then born to obviously drug involved moms. And some of those kids, and this was several hundred kids in 4 states. So this was a large sample. This wasn't like some small 20 kids in a sample. I mean, this was several hundred children followed over about a 3-year period of time. And some of the kids had stayed with the moms for whatever reason. Some of the kids had gone into foster care, and many of the kids had gone into kinship care. And so you had kind of a natural experiment there. That is a comparison of what happened to the infants. And much to my surprise and the surprise of many other people, it was a very, very careful study. The kids who went into foster care compared to the kids who stayed with the birth parents did pretty much the same in terms of outcomes, in terms of behavioral outcomes, and in terms of overall development. The kids who did the best were the kids who were placed with relatives, with kin, pretty much at birth. And why did they do better? Because they had more stable placements. They were not as likely as the kids in foster care to be moved from home to home. So the kids who went into foster care, even when they got good quality care, they were likely to be moved from home to home. That is, from one home to another because of issues around crowding, or at some point because they were going to move into an adoptive home. That would be a possibility. But on average, the kids in foster care had 2 or 3 moves during their episode there, whereas the kinship care infants were stable. And so placement moves have a tremendous effect on infants. So this is why just talking about the effects of placement and stability for all ages of kids, this is not the most informative discussion in the world. I mean, it's really helpful to break this down into age groups and kids who have particular kind of experiences. But when you talk about the effects of placement and stability, they're seem to be most profound on very, very young children. And so, when kinship care was used in these Midwestern states to cause the kids to, have stable care in the first 3 years of life, not surprisingly, I guess the kids did better and markedly better. And then, of course, the other surprise was that the kids who stayed with the parents did better than anticipated, which says that there was a lot more to their parents than just that drug using stuff. That's not just there are more dimensions to people than just whether they're using drugs or not. I mean, it's just to say another common sensey kind of thing. So some of the birth parents had nurturing capacities, and that showed up in the outcome thing, right? So anyway, that's the beta study. Now, in lots of other studies, there hasn't been too much of a difference there. And in probably some of the best studies that I've seen, the key determinant about outcomes more than any other single thing is the level of behavioral problems at entry into care, whether it's kinship care or non-kin care. So again, this may sound kind of common sensey. So if you look at a large sample of kids and you control for age and you control for behavior problems at intake using some kind of a standardized kind of instrument. And then you look at children's child welfare experiences, and then you take this a few years out. The kids who entered care with less behavior problems a few years later, they're just doing better. I mean, regardless of whether they went into kinship care or non kin care. And the kids who entered care with behavior problems, they were more likely then to be moved from home to home. They were more difficult to stabilize. They had longer lengths of stay. They were more difficult to reunify. If they were unified, they were more likely to re-enter foster care. So, for all of those reasons, the kids who had behavior problems in entry into care, take it 5 years out, they continue to have behavior problems in to a much greater degree than the kids who, lack those problems at entry into care. And so, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that kinship care, while valuable from the standpoint of stabilizing kids, has not been a total, so unqualified success in terms of turning foster care into a therapeutic system. And part of the reason it hasn't is because, again, by and large, the relatives aren't taking care of the most behaviorally troubled kids. So where the most concerns are around the functioning of foster care systems is in the services, is in the experience of the behaviorally troubled population, and a lot of times that particularly means the school-aged kids. So when you start looking at foster care outcomes, again, to talk about foster care outcomes just 0 to 17 in the abstract, without regard to state or anything else like that, that's almost like meaningless. And when I read research articles about that, when people do that, or I read advocates make general claims about foster care without any nuance or, yeah, I just get sick of it because it's frankly just plain stupid, just to say it bluntly here, right? But it does matter when you start break it down into age groups here. What we really want, and it seems like in the foster care system, is particularly we want a therapeutic system for the most difficult kids. I mean, we would assume that we're going to be, by and large, be able to provide adequate care for the kids who are not particularly challenging, and that's a pretty large group of foster kids. That's probably on average, as a generalization, sort of a simplification, maybe half the kids who enter foster care. I mean, if they have developmental problems, they aren't major ones. And particularly that's true of a lot of the younger kids. But when you get a lot of the school age kids entering care, a lot of them, because of course they've had very troubled histories, not just abuse and neglect, but all other kind of adversities in life, including poverty, which is a major league adversity. They enter care, they have difficult, they present with very challenging behaviors. And neither the kinship parents nor the non kin parents have been able to cope with that very well in the aggregate. So that is where foster care systems really need to be improved, it seems like to me. And kinship care has not been an answer to that. I want to stress and underline that. As valuable as kinship care is, and it is valuable, and it ought to be a preference in policy, as it is now, and was not for a long time. Nevertheless, it is not a solution to the issue of behaviorally troubled kids in care. And the reason I underline this is because this state's child welfare system and other states as well got in tremendous difficulty over the last decade by betting the bank on kinship care. That is, we could reduce residential care, we could reduce we didn't have to worry so much about the number of foster parents. We could just better support kinship families, and we wouldn't need all these residential care facilities or programs. We wouldn't need professional foster parents. We wouldn't need therapeutic, but that has all turned out to be false. Insofar as people had those ideas, and many people in this state did in fact have those ideas, both within the child welfare system and in the advocacy community as well. That just has not turned out to be valid. So the deal today is in this state, probably somewhere, depending on which report you look at and which time period, maybe 40 to 45% of kids in foster care or in kinship care. I worked in the system at a time. I left the agency in 2004. At the time I left the agency, it was probably in the 30% range, something like that. So there has been a real marked increase in kinship care, both in this state and around the country. But even if you look at nationally at the number, it's still under 40% nationally. But in some states and some large counties, it's as much as 60%. So this is another message from that policymakers ought to really attend to here. It is really possible by supporting kinship families better and by particularly by helping them through the licensing process and by encouraging them to be licensed, become licensed rather than encouraging them not to become licensed. States can really up that kinship care rate to close to 60% and make it stick. That is a direct result of policy and the extent to which agencies are willing and able to support kinship placement. So, Washington State in this regard is doing relatively well compared to most of the rest of the country, but it probably really can do better. We probably can get I'm just estimating that this state could probably get its kinship care rate safely up to more than 50% of the population. So, generally speaking, for the kids who enter care without a lot of behavior problems, if at all possible, you want those kids to go into kinship care for reasons that I've already mentioned here. And the other thing I want to mention, just one more issue around the positive sort of effects of kinship care, is the maintenance of sibling connections. So there is a literature here, and there's a lot of science on this particular subject. So the value of sibling connections over the life course, not just in childhood, not just in sort of helping children to feel more secure in the short run and to maintain family units and so forth, but over the life course, sibling connections are a very, very powerful source of emotional support. And kinship care does a better job, and usually a lot better job, of maintaining sibling connections, particularly with somewhat larger sibling groups than non-kin care does. So it's always been awkward. It's always been a matter of policy issues and program and resources about how to maintain sibling connections when kids are in different foster homes. And usually in practice, that really involves the commitment, the buy-in of the foster parents, the idea that caseworkers can manage all this, and that's just not realistic usually. It usually depends on the foster parents understanding the needs of the kids and being willing to go out of their way to make it happen. But it's awkward. I mean, at best, it's awkward. So let me see. Can you provide the name of the report so we can, the name of which report? Susan, you're asking the name of the report so we can research? Which report are you asking about?
It was already provided.
Oh, the beta article. Yeah. Now I will send Ryan a couple of other recent articles on kinship care, which summarize some of the things that I've said here. Because there is, again, to say this again, there's a lot of research on this particular subject here. So, but before I go any further here, now let me mention one other thing. I do want to mention one other thing because this is a big subject and this is a big important subject, right? So it turns out that when I was at Casey there from, again, 2010, 2016, at one point, a researcher at Casey went back and looked at, in a retrospective way, the child welfare experiences of kids who were in the 12 to 17-year-old age range in child welfare and still in foster care. Well, much to her surprise, she found that 1 out of 6 of those kids had entered care in the first couple of years of life. So I want to say this again. In this particular study, this researcher found that if you just took a random sort of sample of kids who were in care at age 15 or 16 and looked back on their child welfare experiences, you would find that 1 out of 6 of those kids entered care. So you would think, well, how could that be true? I mean, how could that be true in the era of AFSA, Adoption and Safe Family Act, with these timelines and everything? How could that even have happened? Well, one of the ways that it happened was that a number of those kids had entered care very early on in life and they had been placed in kinship homes. And those had been pretty stable placements up until the time that the kids got to be about 12 or 13 or 14, at which case, just as in non-kin families and in birth families, a lot of those placements begin to disrupt at that point in time. And so a lot of those kids came back into care, even though they had been stabilized in kinship care for over a decade. So you end up with kids in care. So I guess what I'm saying is, obviously kinship care is more stable, but at the same time, it's not 100% stable. And when kinship care breaks down then in early adolescence and cannot be maintained there because of the behavior problems of kids, you end up with kids in this weird situation where they entered foster care as infants, but somehow at 15, they still don't have a permanent plan. Um, are they disrupting at that time due to generational differences? They're usually disrupting because of behavior problems. So again, just to say this again, the main weakness of kinship care is the main weakness of non-kinship care that's on a volunteer basis. That is, people are not prepared by education or by motivation or by economics or any other way to take care of a very behaviorally challenging group of kids. So that's the difficulty in child welfare. And that is true for the kinship families as well as for the non-kinship families, right? Um, so anyway, there's that group of kids then who age out of care. Well, it turns out that a lot of those kids were in fact in kinship placements as well as in non-kin placements. So, when you look at studies then of what happened to kids in care, usually it's not an either or thing. Usually it's not a child was in kinship care or a child was in non-kin care. For a lot of the kids with multiple placements, they had combinations. They were in kinship care some of the time and they were in non-kinship care some of the time. And that's particularly true for the kids who are bounced all over the place here, right? So before I go on and we change the subject here to a little more controversial issues here, let me just stop and see if you have comments or questions.
Yeah.
Um, oh, go ahead, Karen.
I just had a question. Can you just describe briefly the practice in Washington? Do kin have the option to become licensed or have a less, strict procedure to go through? And generally, what's more prevalent?
Okay, remember I left the agency in 2004. So I'm not up to date on what the situation has been in recent years. I'm just going to tell you the way it was in the past there. And I would be surprised if there was a big change, but then on the other hand, there might have been there. So in past years, yes, foster parents by policy had to be given the option of being licensed or at least of seeking a license or of going to TANF for welfare to, receive support through that means, right? Okay, one of the things that influenced those kind of judgments was that the agency, partly because of federal policy, but also because of state policy, had a list of disqualifying sort of past experiences in the criminal justice system. So if any relative, for example, had been in prison for assault or for murder or for attempted murder or for a whole bunch of other crimes, then those parents or those relatives might be disqualified from seeking a foster care license. So this has been one of the issues in kinship care for a long time, this issue of the extent to which people's own early histories in their adolescence or their early adult life, their histories of incarceration. Of course, that is hugely important issue when you deal with Black families, when you talk about a third of all Black men between the ages of 21 and 34 having been in prison. I mean, some phenomenal number like that. But so you have a lot of relatives in some of these families who are disqualified by virtue from becoming a foster parent by virtue of their criminal justice histories. And I'm not sure to what extent in recent years that has really been changed in a more positive direction, right? So when I was an area manager, we could sometimes give exceptions, and sometimes I did, me personally. Sometimes I could make exceptions to that policy, but it became harder when that became embedded in federal law there. And of course, just understand the risk that any manager is taking. Like, what if someone was in prison for attempted murder or for murder or for some other horrible crime, and they get out after 10 or 15 years, and then I'm a manager, they apply to be a foster parent, I'm a manager, I give them a waiver or I give them an exceptional policy and allow them to be licensed, and then they harm a child. What do you think the consequence is going to be for my career? So for any manager who's risk averse, the tendency is not to make those kind of judgments, right? So yeah, so those are the kind of the factors there. And I don't think a lot of times the kinship families really quite understand the extent of the economic differences between being licensed and not being licensed. So this is an area where we have had private child placing agencies in this state. We have had supportive services to kinship families to help them be better informed about the relative level of benefits, but also to help them to become licensed. The licensing process in and of itself, is difficult, and particularly if people not have homes that are large enough. Sometimes, you need to make changes in the homes so that something needs to change in terms of a bedroom or something so that a family can be licensed. And agencies can make that happen, or they can just decline to make it happen. And this is why I'm saying that rates of kinship care always, to a certain extent, depend on the commitment of the agency to doing that. And in Allegheny County, and where they're famous for supportive kinship care, about 2 out of 3 foster parents are kinship foster parents. They are licensed, and they do receive a lot of support, and in some states in this country, it's less than 30%. So there's at least a 2-to-1 difference among states there in the rate, the level of kinship care there. So other comments or questions?
Hi, Dee.
Yeah.
Thank you for the training today. So a couple of the changes that I've seen in this area is that they are licensing kin homes for guardianship.
Mm-hmm.
And so they only have to bring their home up to a certain, like for instance, um, one of our kiddos it doesn't have a bedroom. He sleeps on the couch in the living room,
Mm-hmm.
and but he's with grandpa, and he's in a very safe place, and they have a great relationship. Um, and DCYF is saying that he's licensed for guardianship because he's supportive of the parents understanding that recovery is longer than the dependency timeline. And
Mm-hmm.
so he's supportive of adoption or guardianship. And then the second thing is that in region 3, I'm not sure about the other regions, but Heidi Plus will meet with everybody about permanency planning pretty early on, as soon as you kind of get an inkling that this might move towards guardianship or adoption. um, she'll start meeting with everybody, and she holds those meetings every 6 months, and sometimes doubly towards when you're getting towards termination, so that everybody understands the benefits of both guardianship and adoption. um, and she's great at explaining it all. So those two things I've seen kind of change recently.
Well, those sound like positives. And so, yeah, so agencies can really do a lot to make things happen, or they can stand in the way and prevent it from happening as well there, right? So um, I do want to say one other thing before I get into the kind of the controversial thing, just about the issue around guardianships. I'm glad you brought this up here, because this has been a way to achieve permanent plans for lots of kids who, for whatever reason, could not be adopted. And of course, some of the relatives just don't want to go through a termination of parental rights. I mean, and a lot of Native American tribes, that's anathema. They don't want to end parental rights. They want to maintain them. And so guardianship has been a way of doing that in lots of the families, right? And that has been true around the country as well. I do want to say, however, just as a cautionary thing here, that the level of reentry into care after guardianship, and remember, a lot of the guardianships are with relatives, that's less than the reentry into care after reunification, but it's not hugely less. It's probably close to 20% if you look nationally. Here, I'm not talking about Washington, but if you look nationally, the best study I know of, the the breakdown in guardianship placements is close to 1 in 5 over a period of years. And of course, that makes sense that that would be so because a lot of the kids who are going into guardianship have behavior problems, right? So while kinship care is a good thing and guardianship is generally a good thing, it doesn't always work any more than anything else always works. And so again, the rate of breakdown there is close to 1 in 5 over a period of a few years there, right? And the older the child is at the time of the guardianship and the more behavior problems they have at the time of the guardianship, the more likely there is to be a disruption of the guardianship. That's just a straightforward kind of a risk kind of thing there. Okay, so what I want to do in just a few minutes here is I want to deal with this issue around what about these decisions that caseworkers have to make, CASAs have to weigh in on, courts have to make all the time around should kids be moved out of homes, out of non-kin homes where maybe they live for months or maybe even a year or two. I mean, really, sometimes pretty long periods of time. And then a relative comes forward, maybe from another community, another state. The relative doesn't have necessarily any relationship with the child at all, but they want to because they're family. And so they ask for the child to be because they are family. And so this has been for a long, long time, not just recently, for decades. This has been an issue around, well, what's in the best interest of those kids? And it used to be that just about everyone that I worked with assumed that the best interest of the kids was to stay with the foster parent, particularly if they had lived there for long periods of time, and if the child didn't have a relationship with the relative at that point in time. But over the years, those attitudes have changed markedly. And so by the time I left, and I remember I left the agency again in 2004, 18 years ago. By the time I left the agency, I would say at least half the people I worked with, their perspective had changed entirely, which it was that almost in any circumstances at all, it was in the interest of the kids to be placed with the kinship family. I mean, even if that involved a move after a year, after 18 months, after 2 years, regardless of how stable the child was, regardless of the child's early history, whatever, assuming again that the families were both pretty equal. I mean, in terms of uh, the assessed ability to provide nurturing care. I mean, assuming that, right? And so over the years, then, maybe once or twice a year, someone will get in touch with me. Sometimes the guardian ad litem, sometimes a therapist, someone like that. And they will say, well, is there any research on this subject around foster kids being moved from homes where they've been for a really long time and they're stable and they're doing well? The foster parent's a psychological parent, but they have a relative from the East Coast or somewhere else, and they really want this child to be a part of their family. And so, what do we know about stuff like that? And so, every time that someone sends me this kind of a question, of course, they always have an idea of what they think the answer ought to be. And I always have to tell them the same thing, which is we don't have good research on this particular subject. In fact, in recent years, I cannot remember a single study in the last 10 to 15 years that I've read that specifically took a group of kids in foster care who had been there for some period of time and then they were moved into a relative's home around what was the outcome of that kind of arrangement or that kind of decision compared to the kids who remained with the foster parents. And you would think that someone would have done a research study about this, but if there is one, I want someone to point it out to me because I have looked in journals, I have not. So usually I have to tell people that we don't have good research on this subject, and this is a social value decision. And so there are some decisions in child welfare that everyone thinks there must be some sound research for supporting whatever their opinion is, whatever their social value is. But in this particular instance, and in a number of others, there isn't. So this is a social values question. And I have found that when you deal with social values question in child welfare, the less research there is, the more convinced everyone on both sides of the issue is sure that they're right. I mean, and like the convictions are just so powerful. And yet, to say this again, at this point, it's not an issue that science can resolve. I mean, I've had some people who are very familiar with all the research on attachment and so forth claim that the sort of the implication of that research is that you should not be moving those kids, and that was definitely the view of a lot of the very famous people in the psychological community in past decades. But when it comes down to a very concrete kind of, do we have studies that we can go back to and point to, the answer is no. I mean, at least in the last 15 years that I've seen. And if someone knows of such a study, and I mean, even if like of case examples, like of even if it's just a study of a single child or a study of a handful of kids, but I don't know of any study like that. Um, so so finally, just to say one other thing, when I was a Region 6 administrator, I was a regional administrator for 7 years in this state. And during the last year or two I was there, I got asked to, decide on a case where there were two siblings and they had been placed in different foster homes in Region 6, and they were both doing extremely well. And it was obvious that the mother's rights would be terminated. And so one of the foster parents was willing to take both of the kids, and the other foster parent wasn't. But both of the foster parents were doing very, very well with the kids, and the kids were thriving in those homes. So the question was, should we take the child thriving in the one home? If he stays in that home, he will be separated from his sibling for life, for childhood. Compare and move this child to the home of the parent who has the other sibling who's willing to take him. So to do that, to make that decision, I convened an expert committee of 3 people in this state from outside the child welfare system for whom I had the highest regard. And I knew who were very knowledgeable as anyone could be on this particular subject. And we met with all the parties, and I mean, we met with them personally, and we went to see the kids, because this is a life-changing decision kind of thing, right? And after much reflection and thought about this committee of very esteemed professionals decided that the sibling in the one home should be moved to the home that would take both of the siblings. And at that point, I was not in agreement with that decision, but I went along with what the committee decided, which was that. And we did, in fact, move that sibling. Okay, because I was so concerned about that, before I left the agency there in 2004, after about a year, I went to visit that sibling. I didn't just call him on the phone. I set up a visit, and I went and I wanted to see how this kid was doing. And I went to see the siblings in their, now adoptive home, right? And much to my relief, both kids were thriving. Both kids were thriving, include the child who had been moved. There had not been, as far as I could tell, any developmental impact on the child who was moved at all, right? And I deeply feared that there would be. So that's a single case, but it was educational from my standpoint. And why did the group decide that? Because these were very knowledgeable people about attachment issues and so forth, because they understood the literature around the importance of sibling connections over the life course, over an entire lifetime, not just in childhood, right? Okay, I think with that, I'm going to stop, and it's about an hour, and give you a chance for a last comment or question.
I just posted this in our in the chat, but one of the things, especially in those cases that you're talking about, where do we move the kid to the stranger family member after they've been somewhat stably placed, one of the things that we're really focusing on, because that is such a big push for the department right now, and it's very difficult to kind of, they just don't want to hear it because they're going to do it. But one of the things that we're asking our volunteers to do is advocate for a better transition plan. And just not to say, okay, great, the court ruled that the kid gets moved, but to actually build that out and kind of take some time to establish that relationship before you just move that kid overnight, as a way to kind of mitigate some of that transition drama and make that a little bit of a smoother transition, if that's the way the case is going to happen, to basically slow down.
Yeah. So let me just tell you that in past years, as compared to now, maybe there's been a lot of improvements in child welfare. I think that's maybe debatable, but whether there has or has not, we used to do really a lot of thinking, training, and practice on transitions. That is super important. That goes way beyond the issue of kinship care. I mean, as important as it is. And so there is just a way to move kids from foster homes into adoptive homes or from foster homes back to birth parents. There is a way to do it that minimizes the possible emotional damage to kids. So everyone in child welfare should be aware of that. And of course, the famous book on this particular subject is the Vera Fahlberg book, A Child's Journey Through Placement. That book came out in 1992 or 1993. It probably is still the best practice guide in child welfare today, as amazing as that sounds 30 years later. So anyone who is having any role in moving kids around anywhere at all should read the Fahlberg book, whether you're a guardian ad litem, a caseworker, a therapist, or whoever you are, kind of thing, right? So yeah, the subject on transitions, right? So the rule, just the last thing I will say, after having struggled with these questions over a very long career and being in touch with the kids, one of the things I think it's very important for decision makers to do who are making decisions like that is to meet with the kids and all the people involved personally. Never make a decision based on just case information and a record. Go meet the people involved so that it has a human dimension there, right? But the rule that I used was that once kids had been in care for a year, before a year, that was something else. Once kids had been in care for a year and they were stabilized in care for a year, if a relative showed up from out of state and said they wanted that kid, I wasn't going to support that unless the unless the Indian Child Welfare Act said that I had to. And if it did, I followed the law. We did what the act said that we had to do there, right? But other than that, I would generally support, me personally, keeping the child with the foster parent where the child had been for the first year, usually for the first year of life, if the child had been there at least a year. If the child had been there for a few months, a relative showed up, we would move the kid. Now, I understand that attitude has progressed to the point where, just what Ryan said, it doesn't matter whether the child had been there a year or two or whatever, a relative shows up, they're moving the kid. That's a social value decision. I want to emphasize that. That is saying our social values are such that kinship relationships are so important, we're willing to do this kind of disruption, right? And that's something deeper perhaps than research. Okay, with that, I think I'm going to stop this and just say that since there is a lot of research on this subject, and I have some of it, well, obviously a lot I don't have, but if any of you are interested in any subject that we've talked about here, if I have something that I can offer you, then please feel free to get in touch, or you can do so through Ryan or something. So I think with that, I'll stop.
Thanks so much, Dee.
Okay.
Really appreciate your knowledge on this subject and kind of being willing to share it with us so readily.
And then perhaps we can just say that in May, if we're going to stay on the schedule, we can stay on the fourth Friday thing if you want to there. So
that'd be great. I'd love that.
Okay. And if people have ideas for a subject that you would like to discuss the next time, you can, let Ryan know or me, and I'll be glad to accommodate them.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks.